So what we're going to do now is report back some of the highlights from the 3 rooms. There is no question that the richness of the conversation in each of these rooms and at each of the tables will not be reflected in the summary you're going to hear right now. We're going to attempt to do that justice. But as I said at the beginning, we're taking very detailed notes. You would have seen each of your facilitators doing that. And they are submitting them to our team. We're making sure we integrate it, and that will all be in draft to you to take a look at the summary from your room and make sure that it's an accurate reflection of what transpired at your table and then in your room. And if you have questions or you have an issue that we've gotten something wrong or it's off base, let us know. This is an important part of being collectively responsible for accurately understanding and documenting what happens through these sessions, because it is an important decision-making tool for Waterfront Toronto. Decision-making input. So what we're going to do is, starting with volume 1, 2, then digital, and then volume 3, we're going to ask the lead facilitators from those rooms to give us 3 to 5 points on kind of what emerged from your discussion. We'll work through that slowly first. Then we'll make sure that we have an opportunity to move the mic around the room in case you have any points you want to emphasize, anything that you think is really important to raise to the group that you haven't as yet, or if you have any final questions for Waterfront Toronto. Matthew.
Great, thanks very much. So we had really rich discussion about the proposed development plans, the social infrastructure, and also economic development. One of the key things we heard was that this is an exciting opportunity for the waterfront and for the City of Toronto more broadly, but that Waterfront Toronto and the city as well really need to be strong actors to ensure that their objectives and objectives for the citizens of Toronto are achieved through anything that does go forward. We also heard that there's trust in Waterfront Toronto and appreciation for this process to be able to learn more and share feedback in relation to what is being proposed. We also talked about some concerns and advice related to those. So the fact that it appears that Sidewalk Labs is out in front in terms of timing and in terms of the process, and there's a real need to bring other actors, including the public, up to speed to what's going on. Some more specifics were that there's appreciation for that there's a school in the area plan, but that there's no high school, that transit really needs to be done well to move people efficiently to and from and around the area, and also need to look at unique funding levers that Waterfront Toronto and the city can use to fund anything that would be going forward. We also talked about affordable housing, and there was quite a bit of support amongst the entire room for affordable housing, and suggestion that it be integrated with other types of market housing as well. We also talked about the governance and looking for more clarity and understanding around the fact that there's 3 levels of government at play here, and how will that all unfold as plans go forward. In terms of social infrastructure, really around a clear understanding of what Sidewalk Labs would actually be able to achieve and implement in these proposals, and what would fall on the shoulders of others, such as Waterfront Toronto, the City of Toronto, Waterfront Toronto, the city, and others, and some reality around what could actually be implemented. And that was not just about social infrastructure, but more broadly as well across everything that's being proposed. And in conjunction with that, the idea that that really needs to be captured in a more accessible, shorter document. So not a 1,500+ page document, but something that's clear and cuts to the chase in terms of what can actually be implemented versus what are just proposed ideas. And then lastly, in terms of economic development, and more of an understanding of what does success look like, and who's setting the parameters around what does success look like. Is it Waterfront Toronto, Sidewalk Labs, others, really being clear on that. And then also understanding, in relation to that success, what is kind of being done in an effort, Sidewalk Labs, potentially just to be taken somewhere else and replicated somewhere else in the world, versus what is Waterfront Toronto looking for in terms of success in terms of economic development for the City of Toronto and for the waterfront. And then finally, what are the benefits for the local and Canadian tech sector? What are those benefits, and being clear on that? So that's a high-level summary of what we heard at our various tables in terms of the plans in Volume 1. I'm going to turn over for Volume 2, which is Alex.
Thanks, Matthew. So I was in the innovations room. We also had a very lively discussion, and I feel that kind of each of the tables really was able to dive deeper and kind of get a bit more critical with the topics at hand. I just want to highlight kind of 3 key points that I saw going throughout the tables. The first one being that in some cases, there is, acceptance and interest in innovation, particularly at the public realm table. However, everyone feels that there is a need for more information moving forward before we look at that. The second point is about governance and structures and transparency, and ensuring that, we make sure that those are clear moving forward. And some participants also felt that it's really important that we keep that governance with the city. It's all great that we have an innovation hub in a city center, but it has to be good for Toronto and good for everyone. And then the third kind of key point is about digital governance and data, kind of looking at, is the most high-tech solution the best solution? And if it is, how does it play out? When is it enabled? All that. So I'll quickly go over kind of some of the key points as well from each of the tables. So in mobility, there was interest and concern on the future of the tech use and the nature of how that data will be used, which I kind of already mentioned. Data and digital governance is something that's already in our cities. So how do we make sure we stay on top of it and ensure that the policy is in place, the regulatory bodies? And another part is the kind of cost and potential harm to some of these things that can happen. And it really is important that we have a wider conversation about what happens on site. And this is kind of looking at how, Quayside cannot act insular, separate of Toronto. It has to be integrated well. In terms of, mobility technology, we have to have, heated bike paths, all that stuff. It has to be integrated throughout the city to be effective. Looking at sustainability, there was a lot of clarity needed on what sustainability even means. Is it about tech solutions completely, or does it have to do with financial aspects? So people were really looking for more answers with that. Another part was looking at how the role of natural systems and low-tech solutions and where those would be appropriate over the high-tech parts. So, looking at green roofs, which I'm sure are proposed, but, ensuring that that isn't just glossed over in the proposals. And really, how is it integrated with the rest of the city? How does green and sustainable things help to make the greater area better? Going over to the public again, a lot of people were asking about what is the give and take with data and this technology, and also looking at, what is the difference between nonprofit partnerships and profit partnerships? But in general, this table in particular thought there were a lot of good ideas, and they'd like more information. And lastly, touching on building and housing, one key point was ensuring that everything to do with this was accessible and inclusive, ensuring both with how the space it was built and for the people. And a key aspect of this is looking kind of at an 880 cities model, so someone who's 8 years old and 80 years old, and kind of looking at how that could all be, covering those 2 areas is good for everyone. And lastly, in that group, they talked about transitional housing, group housing for people with accessibility needs, and ensuring that we're going above and beyond kind of just AOTA compliance and the different regulatory bodies that are there now. And actually, one more point was looking at the safety of these buildings and what happens for flood protection, stormwater, and whatnot. So now I will pass it on to Ian, Nicole? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I was in the room focusing on digital innovations, digital governance, privacy, and intellectual property. So I'm going to organize the feedback roughly into those categories. I'll start with intellectual property. Generally, I would say that of the people that were receptive to some kind of intellectual property sharing, which did seem there weren't any people, at least in the report back, that said under no conditions should there be any intellectual property sharing. There was, I think, a lot of concern about the structure of the patent pledge and how it really frames the incumbent. It favors the incumbent, so it favors Sidewalk Labs. Multiple people said that they'd really like to see the non-assertion pledge remove the stipulation that it would only apply within Canada because Canadian companies need to be able to take things to market at outside of Canada. We also got some advice to look at precedents for intellectual property sharing, and that that Toronto in Canada, but Toronto in particular, has a reputation as a trustworthy place, and that's a real asset that we don't want to mess with. people were more receptive to sharing revenue and equity over profit. And in terms of the percentages proposed, there was one suggestion to take more of a tiered approach to sharing in intellectual property. So say you would require a higher percentage of profits or revenue from a Sidewalk Labs, could be up to 50%, but that Waterfront Toronto might also collect a smaller percentage of profits from smaller companies that were producing intellectual property. So that's the first category. The second category, which is a broader one, which covers digital governance, privacy, and data collection and use. Again, we got some advice to look at how others have come up with frameworks to govern data collection in digital neighborhoods. There's an interest in understanding the conditions under which others, whether they're researchers or academics, might gain access to data. So what conditions would be stipulated or placed upon them to get that, and connected to that, what reporting mechanisms are connected to that access. So if you get access to this data, what are the requirements for you to report out on how you used it and what you learned? We had some advice for Waterfront Toronto to rely on international ISO standards around data regulation, and that there would be a strong need for regulations and audits specifically around data use. A lot of people felt really strongly that there should be penalties for data breaches and that those penalties should hurt. And that the penalty should be connected to the breach of data, not just the consequence connected to the data breach. So the analogy given was that data should be thought of as uranium. So rather than as something you want to stockpile, it should be something you want to get rid of. And the governance should try to treat it as such. We also talked about there was a lot of concern about breaches and hacks, concern about the possibility of indirect data collection. There was a suggestion that consent isn't really possible in a model like this, so that Waterfront Toronto should really be, and the governments should be acting as a almost like a consumer protection agency in that regard, so taking a really aggressive stance to protect residents and citizens, because it's just not going to be feasible for people to always be able to give consent to every kind of data collection. We also talked a bit about the credential system that's proposed in terms of that there's something really attractive about that. The example given was if you walk up to a bar, you have to show your driver's license, but that bouncer now sees your face, your address, your age, all kinds of information. So a digital credential system might just give that bouncer a red light, green light. So you have higher personal security in that regard. But the flip side of that is somewhere there's a database that has everybody's information in order to operate that red light, green light. And and there was a suggestion that Waterfront Toronto would need to know a lot more about what that database is and how it looks and how it works before feeling remotely comfortable with something like a decentralized credential system. The last couple points, and then I'll turn it over to Nicole, were about process. People really were hoping and disappointed that they didn't see more evidence of how the digital innovations would produce a public benefit, and they suggested that that would need to be really daylighted and front and center in the next round of consultation. We also had some suggestions that the next round of consultation should be organized more around Waterfront Toronto's objectives rather than Sidewalk Labs' proposal. Finally, there was a suggestion for Waterfront Toronto really to use contracts here to, like contract agreements if this proceeds, to exceed current Canadian data law. So they said Waterfront Toronto did that with building design, encouraging LEED Platinum buildings on the waterfront. So what is the LEED Platinum for data collection? And that's what we should be striving for here, to go beyond just what's in current law. So those are most of the highlights. I hope I captured most of it. I'll turn it over to Nicole to talk about Volume 3.
Thanks, Ian. So we had quite a rich discussion, as it sounds like was the case, and a little bit of connection to what happened in some of the other rooms. I think in broad strokes, people talked about huge potential and huge risk. And on the potential side, I think from almost every table, some excitement, potential opportunity to strengthen our institutional systems in Toronto, opportunity for profit sharing, as long as there's strong frameworks, innovation, opportunities in innovation, and happy Sidewalk Labs was doing some of the advocacy and outreach on their own. On the huge risk side, there was some interest in or concern that it was a bit of an overreach, Seems like Waterfront Toronto could do a lot, particularly in the public administrative role, and or some of the roles that Sidewalk Labs proposes for themselves, and that there's a need to be persuaded that the private corporation has a role where we otherwise would have a public actor doing that job. Also, there was some concern and some interest in seeing potential longer-term unintended consequences mapped before we get out there, and a risk assessment having been completed before we even got to this public consultation phase. Which leads me into what I would say a series of comments related to process. So there was some concern that this process was flawed and that Waterfront Toronto in some ways may already be a partner of Sidewalk Labs, but also criticism on the Google Sidewalk Labs side, that just to recognize that how important it is that they have to earn public trust, they're not accountable to any nation state, and that in many examples people have seen that they've acted like bullies in other locations. So we need concrete examples of where some challenges have been faced in other places or things have gone super well, so that this conversation in Toronto can be informed by that. On the other side, there were other folks that said, look, if Waterfront Toronto maintains the spirit of the letter that we saw from the chair, from the chair Steve Diamond, and said, look, there's some opportunity here, but there's also some things that are worrying. If we maintain the spirit of the letter, we're not obliged to do anything that's bigger than 12 acres. Although we shouldn't be upset that we saw it. We asked for innovation. Those are some ideas. We can review it. We're not obliged to do it, and we move forward maybe in a smaller incremental way, and make sure that fairness and due process and consultation continues. So again, a little bit of commentary from both sides. A few specifics, and I'm just grabbing a few of the ideas. Make sure that the proposal could have drawn on local assets and local work in a more meaningful way. The university in Ottawa at Carleton, for example, has done three-dimensional modeling of all of this area. That might have been a nice reference or resource to use to inform how the proposal was put together, rather than making it seem like it's disconnected from many of the resources and assets we already have here in and around Toronto and Southern Ontario. Maybe thinking about leasing land instead of selling land. You know, every 80 years we're going to have a new generation of folks. Why do we have to sell it? Maybe we're going to have a public use for that land in the future. And thinking about revenue sharing versus profit sharing. So a little bit different between those two. Last but not least, and again, I already told the group downstairs there's way more than this, but I'm trying to illustrate sort of the range of things that emerged. There was also an interest in seeing, I think it's Matthew's room said too, like something shorter would be helpful. Even a page that could cut to the chase of what this was all about, and maybe explaining also how's this different than the other types of arrangements that Waterfront Toronto has previously gone into to do other developments along the waterfront, like at this location. I know that was a shortcut for all of the lead facilitators. It was even a shortcut for the table facilitators, so we always wanted to protect the last chunk of the meeting here to see if anybody wanted to reinforce, raise, or ask anything before we wrap up, so that we have a chance to address the room as a whole. Is there anything you want to reinforce, or we have a couple of roving mics, and Cly on that side and Alex on that side. Just put your hand up, and we're going to take some live notes. Before you start typing, Ian, we heard from some of the other meetings that you might get the impression, because we're typing, that this is the only thing that's going to be in the meeting summary. That is very far from the truth. This is just us having to capture what's in the room here. There will be very detailed summaries from each of the breakout rooms. Okay, so we'll come to the back.
Hi there, I just had a quick question. In the map that was initially shown in the morning,
Yep.
There was development that was going already in the Keating Channel West. So I was wondering if Waterfront Toronto can elaborate on what kind of development is happening in Keating Channel West, and if it had any key learnings from the development process, if Waterfront Toronto was part of it.
So what's happening in Keating Channel West, and any learnings from that?
So the lands in Keating Channel West include the Silo site and the 3C site. Silo site is owned by a joint venture between Dream and Great Gulf, and the 3C site is owned by two local developers and a developer from the US. I think on the 3C site, applications have been made. Their zoning is in place. They are working through their application process with the city. And then on the Silo site, I think they're just starting their plans. So, and those are all privately owned.
Any
Can-
learnings from that? I'm just gonna, you said the learning part.
We had negotiated with 3C and the city together, so Waterfront Toronto and the city together negotiated the zoning bylaw, the affordable housing, et cetera, their settlement on their zoning. So we were able to work through all sorts of difficult issues on built form, affordable housing, how they would contribute to that, public realm, et cetera. So good process, and I think we settled in a very good place with them. We haven't had that same conversation with the Silo site yet because they just purchased the land, I don't know, maybe a year ago. I do know it's being used temporarily for an early refugee installation. I don't know much about it, but I know it's being used temporarily for that purpose.
So did you want to connect it to Quayside?
So the question I was like, connecting it back to Quayside was like in the beginning, there were 4 objectives that were mentioned as success criteria: affordable housing, livable cities. How were those objectives met in the development so far in the adjoining site, like the Quayside West? And is there a way to make sure that they're more met in Quayside?
Let me just try it. You're trying to say you put some objectives up for Quayside. Did those apply to other developments? And if so, did you learn anything about whether you could get them at those other developments versus here? Okay, so it's more about the big objectives for Quayside, and you type in everything I'm saying too? No. The big objectives for Quayside, and whether there's any similar objectives you had for other sites, and based on that, how easy, hard challenges you might have come up with faced when you've had to deal with those objectives at other locations.
So as I mentioned, those are in a precinct plan, the Keating Channel precinct plan. That precinct plan was done in 2010, Chris, is that correct? 2010 for the Keating Channel. So it predates Quayside. So Quayside is a piece of land that Waterfront Toronto owns, and we, in 2016, started to look at how could we do things differently on that piece of property. So I would say when we did the Keating Channel precinct plan, we were thinking about sort of advanced things there, but the market and technology and everything has moved a lot since 2010. So Quayside's really on the leading edge of new thinking, and those objectives. Well, we want to solve all those problems across the waterfront. I would say Quayside has taken that next step. So it's actually more advanced than the previous stuff.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
Hi. So what we understood is that this whole process is about a 12-acre land where we want innovation, sustainability, and affordability. When it comes to innovation, we selected a partner who dumped a lot of innovation on us, okay? So my question is, this innovation will need an expensive infrastructure when we think of smart dollies, when we think of as you throw a management system, when we think of a thermal grid, sewage water, etc. So are we able to make this infrastructure economically viable in a 12-acre land? 12-acre land is a small piece of land, it's 2,000 units. So we understand why they went to propose another development as well. So this is my first question. We want innovation, but we give just a small piece of land to develop it, which is not economically viable. And the second question was in terms of governance. So for this 12-acre piece of land, we're putting like 4 layers of governance. We have Waterfront Toronto, we have the City of Toronto, we have Ontario, and we have the Government of Canada. And we have here one partner who's willing to do a lot of things. So are we sure that this partner, we're gonna wait until we rode through the whole process of like approving a concept design and schematic design, have all these people around the table to discuss with? Is it like, in terms of speed and execution, is the city of Toronto able to keep up with those innovation and with the speed required for such an innovative urban development?
What do you think?
That's the question I'm asking the Waterfront at Toronto.
Okay, so they're not going to speak on behalf of Waterfront, on behalf of the city, nor are they going to speak on behalf of Sidewalk Labs. Given the way that you've framed the question, it seems that it's embedded with a couple of strong pieces of advice, but I won't take it that way, since that's not how you put it that way. From Waterfront Toronto, who's the best person to address whether many of the innovations here would be doable on the only the 12 acres? And I'm thinking Aaron or Pina, probably from the innovation room. I just can't see where you are. Are Aaron or Pina in the room? Who's the best person from Waterfront Toronto to speak to that? Is it reasonable that these innovations, and are you in a position to be able to speak to it? She's coming. Because those folks were leading that room, and they've been back and forth on that for quite some time. The other folks that are from Waterfront Toronto that are hanging around on the side conferring, come on in. Aaron and Jeff, come on up.
I'm just trying to think through.
You don't have, you just have to think, is it reasonable that a lot of, the question is, clearly, you've asked for innovation. Clearly, you started on a 12-acre site. The question is it possible that some of those innovations are all only really going to manifest their benefits at a larger scale? We don't know the answer.
I think there's two ways to answer the question. I'm going to start with one way, and then I'm going to ask Aaron to weigh in from a sustainability perspective. We have heard repeatedly in the rooms a trend around the fact that whatever you build at Quayside has to integrate to the bigger city. So it is impossible, in my opinion, to deliver, heated, you can deliver heated pavement at Quayside, but what is the value of heated pavement when you only are moving about half a kilometer on heated pavement on the Martin Goodman Trail? Presumably, you're not moving from your home. I guess you could use it to move from your home to your workplace if you lived and worked in Quayside, but you're probably by bicycle trying to get to a bigger zone. I think the second area is on the financial viability of a bigger, of some of the, and the costs associated, as you mentioned. And maybe, Aaron, do you want to speak to that specific to the sustainability components?
Yeah, for sure. So on sustainability, I'm just like, hello. So the carbon reduction measures that are outlined in the plan have a certain amount that's achievable within a 12-acre site. It's shown as 85% in Sidewalk Labs' proposal. And then they've shown that on a larger geography for a few reasons, one being economies of scale, the second being access to waste heat from other processes, that you can actually get beyond net zero and you can actually get into climate positive. We asked for climate positive in our objectives for the project. And so I think that is one example of how there's an inherent benefit to working at a larger geography. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
I think that both of them did a decent job. One is what would be the point of doing it in such a small area. In some cases, the utility would be low. In the sustainability case, it can be more sustainable if it's bigger. Quayside alone, only 85%. To the second point, and I'm just going to flag the Waterfront Toronto team, do you have a sense of the patience of Sidewalk Labs to working with Waterfront Toronto and the three levels of government, our existing governance framework, and the concern or the comment, not a concern, the observation that maybe the typical processes we work through to make decisions, Sidewalk Labs may or may not be patient to wait through those? And then I'll go to the next person.
Thanks, Nicole. I can't speak specifically for Sidewalk, but what I will say is what I've read in the MIDP is they talk about patient capital. They have been here now for 18 months. I think they do understand the process and the intricacies of what they're asking for and how complicated some of these innovations actually are. So I put those two things together and I say to myself, they're probably, wanting to keep progressing on this. And on the Quayside versus the larger area, this is a proposal. We haven't approved anything, as everybody knows. That's why we're here. So it really is to look at the benefits and the risks of all of this. And anything beyond the 12 acres is going to be decision-making for others like the city, the province, et cetera, because Waterfront Toronto only owns the 12 acres.
Okay, next question or comment. Yeah.
Yeah, the 1,500 pages sounds like they threw the Jell-O against the wall and they're hoping to see what sticks. But my question is to Waterfront is this: have you explored what's happening in innovation spaces across Ontario and Canada? For example, I'm in Cobourg, and we have a Venture 13. They have just received $4.2 million from the federal government. As a taxpayer, my concern is that there's lots of little money going down for 1,000 blooms, but there's no capacity, and this is probably a problem that the government faces in terms of open government and open government partnerships, is that they should also be asking you what you've done in terms of, and how you can share outside of Toronto. You need a bigger geography for economies of scale. We could be doing things, and we are doing things in Cobourg that you're not doing here in Toronto. You may not believe that, but that's happening. And the example I give you, and I'll leave it at this, is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. And there's now currently a proposal that the government is asking for in terms of water quality and eco-health. It's a joint agreement between Canada and Ontario, and we should all be, or Waterfront should be providing feedback to them as well.
Okay, Christina, I think is the best person to address it.
Thank you for raising this. Actually, it's something that's particularly a little passion of mine. I'm from Windsor, so if you think Cobourg, people wonder if you do innovative things. I'm Windsor, come on. The reality is there's so much happening in all of the local ecosystems, and this project, Waterfront Toronto's always had a mandate to share both its knowledge and opportunity, both locally and then provincially and nationally. So we're looking to tap into those networks. And one of the things that we've been encouraging Sidewalk themselves to go through is to understand what's happening in other, if you will, centers of excellence throughout the province in particular, to see if there's a way of actually leveraging this as a project opportunity, a sandbox site for other jurisdictions to come and try their new products, new services, and so on. But we're really interested in sharing our lessons learned with other groups as well. So if there's opportunities to do that, we'd be more than happy to do that. And if there's some exciting innovations that are happening, we're always keen to learn about those. But we do monitor sort of all of the FedDev pieces that go out, the new funding agreements that go out. We get notifications on that. We're very tapped into the local ecosystem, like the Marses of the world and so on. But we do need to broaden out a bit more of a direct contact with groups that are perhaps in your neck of the woods and even further afield.
And we've said that, I think the last two meetings, that has been pretty consistent that this proposal needs to demonstrate how it's connected to the current context, not only locally outside of the scope of the geography, but also connected more broadly to, for example, the ecosystem you're talking about, the much broader sort of innovation digital ecosystem. So Alex and then Cly, and there was a hand up right in the middle, and I'll go Alex, Cly, then we'll go to Julie, and then we'll move the loop again. Okay, go ahead.
Just a comment, it is very good to see Waterfront Toronto taking control of this consultation process, because the last 18 months it's been a little unclear, Waterfront Toronto Sidewalk, so the distance between the two and Waterfront Toronto having an independent consultation process is good. Just a couple of points about the next round, maybe a bit more information in terms of timeline and when things are likely to be approved and not approved. And if there's a way that Waterfront Toronto can say or limit what things are actually in the discussion, if there are things that are simply not going to happen, can we just take them out? Because there is so much information here, and it's very difficult, even for those of us who've been following from day one, to keep on top of it. So if there are things that simply aren't going to happen or aren't on the table, just take them out of the next round, and we can focus on what is on the table.
Okay. I'll go here, and then I'll come over to you.
Thanks. My question really follows from that. There's a lot in the MIDP, as far as I've read. I think I've got about 700 pages so far. It's really spoiled my life. Anyway, there's a lot that suggests that Sidewalk expects to get very special treatment from governments, both when it assumes there'll be a school and a health facility, when there are places all over the province that have been waiting years for their schools and health facilities. Is Sidewalk going to get special treatment? Have they been given any reason to think they would? And that extends to all the list of changes to from federal legislation, provincial legislation, and Toronto bylaws. Are there any precedents for a private corporation to expect that governments would just enact a whole lot of special legislation just to suit their site? Would it mean that every developer in the province can ask the province to rewrite the building code to suit their requirements? The implications of all that, there is so much buried behind the assumption that all of this regulatory framework can be changed that I'm sorry to be so blunt, but it's really quite deceitful to allow that kind of implication to be in the MIDP without clarifying whether it's possible or not.
This is a very similar discussion we had for a short period at my table in the partnership room. So who's the best person at Waterfront Toronto to speak to it? Lot that suggests that Sidewalk Labs expects very special treatment from governments, and would the changes to legislation be relevant to them alone? Would others then be also able to follow up and ask where, and I'm looking at my volume 4 people, all of whom are supposed to be sitting right in the front row, volume 4, volume 3 folks, so they're probably in the best position to address it. Your hand's going straight up. None of them are in the room. Okay, maybe all the volume 3 people could come in and have a seat over here, because it's really important, you guys, that you're ready to help us answer this stuff. Okay, Meg.
So no promises have been made to Sidewalk. I can't speak for the city, but the conversations we've had with the city, at the moment, process is normal. So they have put a proposal together that would seek for some upfront permissions on the building code in particular. For example, I think, I'm not the expert at this, but I don't think they're asking to change the building code. They have to go through some, it's sort of like a parallel process with the officials at the city and the province and at the federal level, I think. Where they would prove out the technology and to see if it can work. That may, years from now, change the building code. Like right now we're at 6 stories. I know that they are thinking about 12 stories, the province, and you've got 2 12-story asks on the waterfront already. They're working through that sort of parallel process. So, you know, we are just seeing this, the idea district, the upfront permissions. I think there probably are examples, Julie, around the world where you have innovation zones. They've called it an idea district, but it's similar to that. Whether the city would agree to that, whether the province or the feds, these are all discussions that have to happen. They've been promised nothing, particularly by Waterfront Toronto, and I don't think by the governments either. Was there any more to that question?
Well, Eric's here, and I think in broad strokes, just while we give Eric a minute to think it over, I think in broad strokes, at the very minimum, what we'll take as a piece of advice is that before we would do any more detailed discussion about any of the proposed legislative or regulatory changes, we would have a very clear handle on whether that is a privilege to one company or whether that sets a precedent for many, many others. At a very minimum, we would take it as a piece of advice. Eric was in the volume, thank you for, after I was, that's perfect. Do you want to speak at all? Because we've had the questions come up a few times around how Waterfront Toronto handles the government obligations that come along with the draft MIDP or proposed with the MIDP. Other than a piece of advice, you want to flesh out a little bit?
I'm not sure that I can flesh it out much more than Meg already has. I think that the important thing is to say that if there are innovations that we think are valuable and that regulation currently doesn't allow for it, is that something that we want to consider? But Sidewalk Labs has made, this is their proposal, and we have not agreed to make any regulatory change. So it's a question of whether we want to consider how to make these things operable or not.
Great, thank you. Okay, next point.
Hi, thanks. So just building on a couple of these things, we're talking about beyond just the geography of Quayside, and we're talking about if there are changes or new things, having them apply to more than just this deal. And I really want to encourage you at Waterfront to think that way on the data governance side of it in particular. Because, you know, if you think about the bike path and, you know, just going a half kilometer on the heated pavement, you apply that to data, we move around the city as individuals or as groups. What happens with smart cities in Quayside has to be the same thing that happens in data governance in all of the technology embedded, not just in Waterfront Toronto properties, but across the whole city. So really having you take some leadership on pushing that forward, that we don't do boutique deals on data governance with Sidewalk, but that we work with the city to do something that applies across the whole city. And the second piece of that I would really say that's critical with the data trust in particular, and I would encourage you to push back across the table a very bright lines proposal on the data trust, that it is independent and citizen-owned or user-owned, that it acts as an advocate and a protector for citizens and their data, basically a data fiduciary, which is the kind of thing that's being talked about in Europe, and that's the kind of long-term approach to it, and that it includes both the transactional data and the city data. You really can't take those things apart, and you don't actually have the utility that others can innovate on top of if you don't put those two kinds of data together.
Okay, thank you. Over here, okay.
I'd like to suggest a little tweak to the process that might increase agility. Just as an example, the question of scales come up, and that could be explored with the City of Toronto, and you could actually set up a conduit and a working committee at the City of Toronto. And similarly, perhaps to private developers that might own other pieces of land to see whether that's feasible or not. And if it's potentially feasible, then you can continue to explore it. If it's not feasible at all, it drops fast. So with a more agile project, rather than just being reactive, but reaching out, you can succeed potentially in knowing that something's feasible, or fail early and just get on with other things.
Thank you. Next one there. I'll come here.
I was just wondering about the process when we have Waterfront Toronto staff sitting at the tables talking for or giving their interpretation of what Sidewalk Lab is trying to do or proposing to do. I just wondered why, you know, it seems to me they shouldn't be the ones to speak for the project, for the proposal. I think they should be the sidewalk people there speaking.
So that's, I'm glad you've raised it, and we drafted this public consultation approach, and we thought long and hard, not just our team and the Waterfront Toronto team, but also Waterfront Toronto has a stakeholder advisory committee that has leaders from a number of different resident associations and BIAs and others. And as was sort of consistent with one of the participants over here, they thought that there had been too blurry a line between Sidewalk and Waterfront Toronto, and that this needed to be a Waterfront Toronto-led process. So even if the intent of this was not to brief everybody on exactly what's in the MIDP, it was to brief people on how to navigate the MIDP through the lens of a public actor. That's what Waterfront Toronto's responsibility is here. So Sidewalk Labs, as you saw in the opening plenary, there's a few folks that have been to every meeting. They're here to listen. If it means that we need a little more information to understand something, or in many cases, a lot less information in order to understand something, then that's the message that's important to come from this first round of consultation. So that's just a little insight into our thinking. It's certainly, and the Waterfront Toronto staff in particular have been sensitive to not being seen as advocates nor against the proposals that are coming forward. And so what they're focusing on is how to think about it through the lens of a public steward. Charlene.
I guess this is based more partially on what this lady here has been speaking and this lady here is speaking. Going forward, I'm concerned about there's a certain amount of exclusivity going on between parts of the city and the company where we're sort of ending up, and I hope we don't, with the tail wagging the dog. We are the dog, we are the city, we have the credence, we have a world-class name for being trustworthy. We also have a fantastic piece of property that nobody else has right at the foot of our city. It's an unparalleled opportunity. We should be the ones leading all this. Any of the companies that are coming in are going to be large companies. Unfortunately, the large companies that we're looking at, we're talking about Google, we're talking about Facebook, any of those, when it comes to being called to task on unforeseen and frequently foreseen consequences, they thumb their nose at government and say, you know, you can't make me, I'm an international company and I'm not attached to any particular country. That to me is a serious problem. You can also look at Amazon, which did a horrible competition between cities, of which we were part of, to base a headquarters. And then once they chose their city, they went, "Ah, they don't love us," and pulled out of New York. Do we want that type of thing? We also have a problem, again, with the tail wagging the dog. This is our piece of property. This is our asset as Toronto. We have a terrible history of both the provincial and the federal government coming in, offering money, then meddling, then pulling out, and then trying to take the asset without paying for it. So we could put in all this work and have it taken away and be left footed the bill, either by the company or by the country. And I'm sure there's a lot of small companies or small cities in Toronto, or not in Toronto, in Ontario and in Canada that could say the same thing. These are my concerns.
Thank you. Okay, I see one hand up at the, right here, and then there's another hand up at the back, and then we're close to wrapping up. Go ahead, Ed.
You know, when I was reading the mobility section in the MDIP, I thought, yeah, a bunch of us have been saying an LRT would be a great idea for, I think, a quarter century. And I do appreciate that they do have some suggestions for alternative financing, which may have risk attached to them, which may cost more than other means of financing, and, or may be worth exploring and having merit. If I was going to be cheeky, I might suggest that Alphabet dig into its deep pockets and spend it lobbying the provincial government to persuade them of the merit of financing the waterfront transit line. But in all seriousness, I think one thing, and I know that, by the way, I want to congratulate you, your team, and Waterfront Toronto for this process, and I think this is, I think it's been very well run today. And I know that consultations cost money. I understand that. Everyone has to be paid. Facilities have to be paid for. But I'm thinking that there might be merit in having a very focused conversation about the LRT, where we're at now, how we might actually proceed, how sidewalks proposals may or may not fit or may or may not help, and what else we can do to actually move this along and activate it. You know, that may be getting a little too close to advocacy, but perhaps that's what we need. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a suggestion.
Thanks. And as I said at the opening plenary, there's more hands here. Okay. As I said at the opening plenary, we're attempting to manage our technology. We're just teasing. If I didn't know you, I wouldn't say it. We're working hard to figure out, much along the lines of some of the comments that have already been raised, about how to curate and focus the second round of consultation. Well, Waterfront Toronto team is already thinking that over, about where do we need to go really deep because we need to figure something out. Where is it that maybe we don't have to spend that much attention because it's unlikely to be an area, we already have a good idea of how that might unfold, whether that's in a positive or a negative way. Anyway, so we have another hand here. And then, or do you want to, Michael's had his hand up, sorry, do you want to just, Michael's had his hand up for quite some time. So why don't you go to Michael, then we'll come back, I'll come back down here, and then I think we're going to wrap up. Okay, Michael.
So the technology question should not be just about data. Like, I keep hearing that technology, and then you say, well, this is what we think about data. Like, the technology question is about a lot of things, but digital technology means computers, and that means machines that do things and make decisions and control things and activate things. It's not a collection of data, it's a machine. So I think we should remember that the technology question is about artificial intelligence, it's about machines of all kinds, it's about processes that are happening. It's not just this one question that has been sort of pushing aside all the other technology questions.
Thank you.
And on the other thing is about innovation and technology and progress in general. Do we really need it? Do we really benefit from it? it still seems like we haven't got that as a question. It's being given as something that's already been answered rather than as a question. And then that comes down to, do we need Sidewalk Labs at all? Because if you take innovation out of it, they're supposed to be an innovation and funding partner. Well, anybody can do funding. There's lots of financial institutions out there. So do we need innovation at all? We should question it in terms of the consequences of autonomous technology and developments in the future of AI and that kind of thing. Do we actually need innovation? Is that a framework? Do we have to be funding universities and research all the time and just letting that sort of run away and see where it goes? And if we don't need that, if this is a city block that can be developed without necessarily focusing on innovation, then why do we need Sidewalk Labs at all?
Okay. And I'm just going to flag before I come to the final comment here that one of the great and unique responsibilities of a public actor is to understand any particular proposal from multiple points of view. And the great burden of that public actor and governments is to try and find some common ground, if that exists, between multiple points of view. And where it doesn't exist, to try and really understand what are the consequences of moving down particular paths and going into any direction with our eyes wide open. In that case, through a public consultation like this, it is very reasonable to say, I'm not even sure that the proposal on the table or this partnership is something we would want to go into. Notwithstanding that, it is the focus of the consultation, but we do document and make sure that we do all think back about why are we even here in the first place. Okay, so final comment here before I'm going to ask Meg to wrap it up for us.
Thank you for saying that quote, which I was trying frantically to remember because it's my favorite thing I've ever heard you say, and it's the second time I've heard you say it. Thank you for your team for all the work you've done. This has been spectacular, so I appreciate the approach. I have three things, which I hope you'll take as advice as we go into the fall, and I think that's a big opportunity that we all get to come back and take a second round of this. So one is about the framing, the second is about the proposal itself, and the third is about finance, and I'll be really quick. On the framing, I really want to underscore this point that the next time we sit in a room and talk about this proposal, it should be through the lens of what Waterfront Toronto asked for on behalf of all of us, not what Sidewalk wants to sell us. It's nice that they have a big proposal and they have a framework. We should use our framework for what we wanted and what the benefits are and evaluate it based on whether it meets that or not.
Okay.
Second is on the proposal. There was a question raised about whether this whole thing is possible inside the actual 12 acres, et cetera, and Sidewalk has kind of said it isn't. They basically said, we won't even do it if you don't build us the transit, and et cetera, and I think we should go back to them and say, give us a proposal that actually meets the requirements of the RFP and tell us if it works. And if it doesn't, then write us that proposal that says this doesn't work financially because you're not giving us the land at a discount, because you're not forgiving the property taxes for 30 years, because you're not letting us build a timber industry in Northern Ontario, blah, blah, blah. Like, make them say that, and so that we can actually have that conversation as a community. And then the third thing is on the financing. I would love to put to death this idea that we need to borrow money at market rates from a private company when we have 3 orders of government who issue their own debt. We borrow at better than market rates because we issue our own debt because they're our governments. We don't need to borrow this money from them. And the way that we answer that question as a community would be we have somebody, ideally City of Toronto, sit down and please run the numbers for us. So tell us, if we give them tax forgiveness for 30 years, this is what it costs us as a community, and this is what we actually pay for the transit. Versus if we just issued our own debt, let us actually just look at a spreadsheet. And we're all smart folks. Well, we do our own budgeting. We think about these things. Give us the numbers. And so please use the time between now and the fall to put some numbers behind this thing so we don't have to say, well, Sidewalk says the math doesn't work if blah, and the city says whatever. Let's actually just have numbers, and then we can look at the numbers and decide for ourselves.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. So this is exactly the kind of conversation we're hoping to have. We're going to have our final conversation at this initial round of consultation on Tuesday. Some folks have come to more than one, which we strongly encourage if you're interested in diving deep on any one of the volumes. But I think the longer we go through, the clearer the advice is is becoming. So before we end for a beautiful, hot Saturday, I'll turn it over to Meg to wrap it up.
Thanks. So I want to thank Nicole and her team for running a spectacular day. I think it went very, very well. And if you have any more feedback about the process, that's very welcome. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I want you to know how sincerely we are listening to what you're saying. We had some great discussions in our room. We're going to have a meeting about certain topics. I really want you to know that we're listening, we're paying attention. We want to incorporate that into our evaluation. We're going to be feeding all of this back to Sidewalk. Some of the folks are here, but we're going to be giving them a report that we give to you. They're going to see all of that. So this really is a heartfelt thank you for your contribution and to let you know how much we are listening and appreciating that. So everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you so much for sharing your Saturday morning with us.